Welcome to Amplify What You Love, the podcast that shines a light on extraordinary individuals who are making a positive impact in the world. And today I have a very special guest who has devoted his life to innovation, spirituality, and the betterment of all living beings. He's not your typical tech entrepreneur because he has spent years studying Vedanta and Bhakti Yoga, the science of self-realization and devotion, as an ascetic monk in India. But don't let that fool you. He is also a visionary inventor who has patented a distributed network technology and built successful companies around it. His expertise in distributed systems design, biomimicry, and VR has not only earned him a reputation in the tech industry, but also inspired him to create an open source community that can help all life on Earth thrive in harmony. Please welcome my extraordinary guest and my very own brother, Jaya Marks. This is the first official podcast in the studio.
I'm honored to be your guest.
Thank you, brother Jaya. When I think about my podcast, when I think about my platform, one of the main reasons I started it was to be able to have conversations with my favorite people about my favorite topics. And I can think of perhaps no one more favorite to me than you, my brother Jaya.
Ditto.
And so I'm really excited to get to talk to you. I've also interviewed him several times, but I think it's been challenging to create the container to properly interview you and to share the amazing work that you have been creating over the last 15, 20 years, your whole life, your life's work, to share your life's work. And we always get into these great conversations when we go on walks. And so I wanted to invite you onto the podcast because I know that my audience will enjoy hearing from you, will learn from your life story, as well as what you're most interested in working on, your work with math, physics, and God. And I feel like it'll just be a interesting conversation to try and present it. So I was hoping that we could start with your actual story. So first of all, you've had a very diverse life. You've done many things. So to start with, maybe you could walk us through, how does one become a monk? How does that even happen? And how did you get there? And what is a monk?
Do you mean something by monk, or should we define that?
I'll let you define that.
The kind of monk I lived very austerely. I was celibate. Actually, I was, even before I became a monk, I was like a late bloomer and not very active.
In the dating pool?
In the dating pool. But yeah, so I was going to college, double major in math and physics, and I was working on Dancing Ones and Zeros at that time.
And no one knows what that is. So we'll get into what Dancing Ones and Zeros is. That is my brother's life work. But you were at college. You had already had these ideas for this.
And I was looking for a teacher. I was praying, and I started chanting Maha mantra, because from my childhood religion was the Hare Krishna religion.
Let's just dive in there for a second. So why would you even want to be looking for a teacher, and what does that mean to you? Because not everyone automatically grows up seeking a guide or a teacher or a Yoda, as you'd call it.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah. I mean, that is a perfect place to start. Is as a kid, I loved Star Trek too, but I love Star Wars. And I wanted to become a Jedi, and I wanted to find a Yoda who would teach me how to float. And I grew up, Dad had gone to India, and we learned the Vedic stories and philosophy growing up. So I just imagined the way my life would unfold would be that I would go find Yoda, and he would teach me the Force, and I would become a Jedi.
So you had, because of cool movies, as well as the fact that our parents joined a Hindu religion, especially essentially when they were young, we grew up with those influences. So you had role models who were seeking teachers and finding teachers.
And I think as humans, there's an innate aesthetic to the hero journey, especially as a male human. There's a particular story that's real prominent in our species. Actually, story itself animals can have seasons and follow stories based on seasons, but we can articulate much more detailed stories that span many generations, thousands of years within your own life, where you want to end up, where you came from. We're really good at stories.
Yeah, our brain is like wired in story mode.
And the hero's journey is like, okay, there's me in the middle of activity. Where did I come from? Where am I going? And how's that going to feel good in the end? And then this actually reminds me of the honeybee flower conversation, which we can loop back to.
So you'll throughout your life, you sense yourself as a character in a story, essentially, and you become aware that you want a guide, the guardian of the threshold, as they call it in the hero's journey too.
The
right?
Yoda.
The Yoda. You knew that. When did you first know that you wanted a teacher, though? Do you remember?
Star Wars.
You were watching Star Wars and the Yoda.
I was real young, like 5, 6, 7, and I was like, that's me. I'm going to learn how to do the Force too when I meet Yoda. And also in my dream world, I had a very active dream world up until 11, 12 years old, and it was a hero's journey. That'd be a fun conversation in and of itself. I was a very lucid dreamer by the end. I had horrible nightmares, and I learned through chanting Maha mantra in my dreams, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, I could protect myself and then win against the demons and then become ultimately so powerful that there was no fear to be had. Actually, the final thing to go was giant, scary animals, because they weren't monsters. They were just wild and taking care of their own young. And what ended up solving that problem was becoming one of their babies. Anyway, sorry.
You mentioned the Maha mantra, and maybe people don't know what the Maha mantra is. So give us a very brief introductory statement about the Maha mantra, because obviously you're going to dive into it way more, but could you introduce just a little bit about it? And maybe you could introduce it in the terms of like, how did you find your teacher, and why is the Maha mantra so important in that?
Mantra is a mind device. If you very literally translate mantra, it's a mind device. Like there's tantra, yantra, mantra. And our mind, in one sense, is full of meaningful tokens, word tokens, meaning tokens. And seeking pleasure, avoiding pain is what it does. And it makes impressions of what was painful and what was pleasurable. And the Maha mantra, the thesis or the hypothesis, is that you make your mind one with this mantra in the sense of it becoming a carrier wave. And you can populate the Maha mantra with the absolute meaning of the relationship between self and supreme self, or self and other, and dive infinitely deep into it. There's any possible endpoint you could potentially be seeking, you can achieve by riding that carrier wave. So it's like you can picture you're stuck in the 2D layer and you grab hold of something 3D and it pulls you out into the 3D layer. So the mantra is like this hyperdimensional object that you can use to ride out of the limitations of whatever realm.
Kind of like Quantum Leap.
Yeah, the new one or the old one?
I'm trying to think of some analogy, but yeah. So okay, the mantra is a mind device that allows us to transcend our current
limitations of space-time.
Limitations of space-time.
There's a great quote somewhere, Swami Prabhupada, my parents' guru, who he said something along the lines of the spirit, the soul wants to experience the freedom of beyond the walls of this phenomenal universe. It wants to experience the light and the freedom that's past all of that. And so my ultimate goal in my hero journey was always like, I really want to meet my maker. I want to know what's at the heart, what's at the core, what's the furthest extent, what's the absolute truth, what's the because something about coming to the final conclusion, Siddhanta, the perfect final picture of reality, all fear is gone, all discomfort, all misery can be destroyed by that kind of understanding, that kind of knowledge or wisdom.
Wow. I don't know that that's necessarily apparent just for me hearing the idea of like discovering the absolute truth, that fear would be conquered and discomfort and all those things. So I think that that's an interesting place to dive into. But let's go back to you in college. You're chanting this Maha mantra. You're chanting this thing. And how did you find your Yoda?
So yeah, chanting was on and off my whole life. In college, there were so many teachers around, and in high school you have like a fixed pool of teachers, and you got to go to the classes you go to, and you don't go to other classes to audit them. But in college, you can just show up to anyone's class. They don't even know if you're in their class or not, if it's a big class. So I started auditing class, and I was like in this Disneyland of teachers. And I was looking for a teacher who had the answers, who knew the absolute truth and could confer their wisdom to me, and was inspired by some, but a little disillusioned. Like maybe that's not something you can find, someone who's already reached the destination. Because if someone's reached the destination, they can report to you how to get there and you can follow them. That's guru. It's like, hey man, and going back to the honeybee, I found this flower. This is how I got there. And they can share that with other bees, and then those bees go have that.
So it was like you were looking for a beacon in a way.
A beacon.
And you were even studying with basically cutting edge physicists and cosmologists.
Sure, yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, specifically, I think you might be referring to Joel R. Primack, who was one of the beginning crew to look at dark energy and dark matter and create those theories.
So what was it that felt like it wasn't a beacon? Like what specifically made you feel like this isn't it?
Well, so that class, Cosmology and Culture, was a seminar style class where they were looking at all the different cultures of the world and how each of these cultures produced their cosmological picture. And how nowadays we're actually on the precipice of no longer needing to throw out the old pictures. We just refine this picture because it's so perfect. And then there was like a quiz where I got the wrong answer, and I felt like that was hypocritical and contradictory to what was being taught. And so that really disillusioned me. And that was right before I met Gurudev in Badger, California.
Do you remember what that question was?
Yeah, it was, are we like, is the whole universe and everything in it contained in some infinite being, God, essentially?
That was the question?
That was a question, more or less. And the correct answer to that question was no. And I wrote, based on what you taught in this class, there's this wedge of material existence with the Hubble radius being the furthest away we can see, or the furthest back in time and space. And then the density of black holes being the most dense thing where physics breaks down. And then Planck's length being the smallest thing. And we're confined by these different limitations to be unable to see. We're unable to see what's beyond those. And so, of course, we could be in that. Like, I can't say no to that. And that was the wrong answer. And so I was like pretty disappointed with that scenario. And I realized also I had another teacher, and they were saying, it was plant and animal physiology and development. And they were saying in front of a huge 500 kids, they were like, plants have no feelings. And I raised my hand and I said, what's the evidence that plants have no feelings? I had just been reading a paper from Jagadish Chandra Bose where he created these really delicate instruments that felt the vibrations of plants, and he could talk to them. And now I think we know better than that. Now I think we know that plants have an inner dialogue and a communication with other plants, and there's a whole subtle world of experience that they seem to be having. So
it's like your inner, you had some intuitions and some strong opinions about stuff that was in a little bit of opposition to the mainstream or what you were being taught, and so it kind of felt like you felt like there's more that wasn't there.
And that teacher said, I predict in 2 years you'll be religious and not science. And I was like, what do you mean? I'm a scientist. And 2 years later, I was in the ashrams in India doing religion, not science.
I mean,
so they were right.
So much of what I want to talk to you about is about this threshold, because even what we just spoke about with the mantra that helps us transcend limitations of time and space, you know, some people might be like, well, what's the proof of that?
Yeah, prove it.
So, but this is perfect. So can you walk through literally how you met your teacher, the experience of meeting your teacher and what that was like for you?
The Spider-Man story?
Sure.
We were on our way to see Spider-Man. Which one was it? Anyway, I'd already bought a ticket to the movie theater, UC Santa Cruz. And it was a little later, so me and my buddies, group of us, were going to see the movie. We went to this famous toy store that's there downtown, UC Santa Cruz. And they went inside, and for some reason I felt like sitting on the bench, and I was just chanting the Maha mantra in my mind, seeing people go in and out of stores with these different items and thinking, this isn't really what's going to solve our problems, getting these items, and there's something deeper that I'm ready to embark on, a deeper journey. And then Brajendra Nandana, who knew my mother from when she was 17 in the Hare Krishna movement in Brooklyn. I didn't know that at this moment, but he approached me, he tapped me on the back, and he said, have you seen the devotees chanting Hare Krishna? And I was chanting, so I said, I'm a devotee chanting Hare Krishna. And he said, what? Who's your mom? Who's your dad? And he was like, her Natrani, and that's my mom. And then he sat down, and eventually he invited me to meet my Gurudev. And when I did meet my Gurudev, I had a big struggle with, I can't follow someone else. I should go find the absolute truth myself, and then I'll teach everybody else. And I was like, that's so dumb, because why would they listen to me? I'm not even going to listen to someone. Mm-hmm. I had some profound mystical experiences with this person that made me think I was on the precipice of having access to a more magical plane of existence. So I went full in.
So with him, it felt like a beacon as opposed to where you were in college.
Felt like meeting a spiritual master who had gone far into that realm. For myself, there's no denying that this personality who I accepted as my spiritual master really did the work, put in the hours, put in the effort to test out the hypothesis that this mantra can take you to other dimensions. And to be fair, I've done a fair amount too, and the results are great. I found a flower. I don't know, there's other flowers, but this is a really yummy, good smelling, tasty flower that works for me and works for other people like me. And that's the proof is the pudding, right? Is it a tasty flower that you like or not?
I think that epiphany you had is actually really profound. So maybe I need to go find the truth myself, and then I can teach it to people. And then you kind of caught yourself and you're like, well, why would anyone believe me?
I didn't set the example of listening to someone.
Yeah. And I think there's actually something really profound in that. And I don't know that everyone is raised in an environment where mentorship and teachers are sort of elevated. A lot are, but not everyone.
Been talking about this.
I was telling you about this earlier on our walk, and it's interesting because also you can't not also go find the truth yourself. You need to do both in a way. And you talk to me about this all the time, which is I find someone and they can impart all this amazing knowledge, but I also have to actually realize it for myself and find it for myself within myself. And there's even in Buddhism, I think they say, there's a weird phrase if you find the Buddha, kill him. Yeah, it's strange, but the purport of it is you have to find the teaching and not idolize or externalize the absolute truth outside of yourself.
And that doesn't mean assassinate someone. That means
absolutely not.
Remove that part of your thinking.
So
that you're going to rely on someone else to find the truth.
Right. Well, and even if someone is seeing the truth, you still have to look at it.
I've really been enjoying this honeybee analogy.
Yeah, so can you explain that from the ground up?
Yeah, honeybees, they go and they find these flowers, and they find a delicious flower, and they come back to the hive and they say to the other bees, gather round, I found a flower. And the other bees make a circle around them and they do a dance. And through this dance, the other bees can determine like it was a really good flower maybe, because this bee is just like freaking out about this this flower dance. They can decide where it is, how to get there. And I imagine what the bee is doing is actually imparting to them, I went this way and I arrived and it was like this. And then the other bees can replicate that without even following the bee. They can go alone and find that 2 miles away. So it's a very similar principle to the guru. The guru comes back from having tasted the flower on the other side of the veil, coming back from this ecstatic trance of love of God, and says, gather round, let me tell you, this is how I got there. It's up to you to go there. They can't taste it for you.
So here, but the difference for me that where I personally get stuck is from a like empirical standpoint. Reality is what we can experience with our senses, or what we can deduce is the only real possible way that something could occur in reality through our senses. And so when it leaves the world of the senses, which is what spiritual teachers kind of tell us, they tell us, hey, the flower we found is not outside. It's actually inside.
Okay, yeah.
And that then becomes outside of the realm of empirical data. And so the leap there is different. And this is why your work is so fascinating, because part of what you do is meditate on math, physics, and God. And so how do you balance the scientist in you and the devotee in you, or the spiritualist or the transcendentalist?
Love these questions, Kaylee. I just want to recap your questions. It seems like so life story went on. I did the ashram thing for 10 years. I came back, did some companies, but like what I kind of...
No. Nice try, buddy.
What I really love to...
We need the audience needs to understand what you did first.
Sure. Okay, but here's...
So you're not getting out of it.
replay of your 2 questions that I'm hearing, and correct me or adjust these if I'm not getting it. There's a threshold of like belief and faith and rigorous scientific evidence and direct experience, right? There's this tension between the two. There's and there's a threshold of joining the monk life and leaving the monk life. There's that kind of threshold.
And specifically senses and what can be observed by senses.
So 2 questions similar. The spiritual internal world and the easy to agree on external properties of experience.
Mm-hmm. How you somehow still balance the spiritual intangible part, that is what is really fascinating to me, man.
So the interesting thing is there's stories that have like external features of hard to believe things that I did physically accomplished, can do, like mystical abilities on one side, and then the other side is the internal experience, things that I experienced internally, visions and experiences I've had. For me, the latter is like, that's the actual flower, and that's where the credibility lies for me, is like, oh my God, I actually tasted those things. There's no other proof required for me to remember and be able to repeatedly go back to these states of consciousness and states of awareness and flavors and moods. Those are the flower. The other piece is like, humans are capable of incredible feats. And it's like, once you do it, you see that actually the technology that we're born with is really capable of a lot, and what we actually train it to be able to do in our current civilization that's so comfortable with shoes and cars is like very small fraction of what it's capable of. So if anybody does a little bit more of what the body is capable of, it looks mystical and magical. It's really just bodies are mystical and magical. The ability to dance in this realm between the sky and the earth is magic, and it's a miracle, and it was really hard to find the universe with the right properties that let us dance like this, but here we are.
Well, and so when you met your teacher, there was a blur maybe between maybe like full monk mode, or not necessarily, but to where you were in India being a monk, when you really committed and you moved over there. What was day one like? What was that transition
I
like for
mean,
you?
right away when I met, so I had that struggle. Should I listen to this person or should I go find it myself and then tell others? And I was like, my heart had already sort of surrendered to this as being my path. I was beginning my hero's journey. I felt it like in my bones. And so that was happening. And the night before I got formally initiated, Maha Mantra initiation, I had dreams that felt like working through lifetimes of karma, really powerful dreams. And then I went and got initiated, and I went full into mantra meditation practice, and I really focused on it, and I increased my rounds from, at first it was hard to do 8 and then 16. And then by the time I got to Europe, I was at 48, having some visions there, different breakthroughs. And then I got to India and increased more. And then it was like 72. And this is like, 5 to 10 minutes per round times 64. So this can be an 8-hour job of just repeating a mantra and keeping your meditation on a single region of reality for 8 hours. You're training to focus on the lotus feet of Krishna.
And you're in a room? Are you alone? Are you
Wherever
with other
you
people?
are, all day, every day, everywhere you go. But a lot of this was sitting and meditating, and sometimes looking at a picture of Krishna or something, or looking at the deities. And then in Vrindavan, I was in Vrindavan and I was chanting over 64 rounds. 64 rounds is like master level. And there's this initial stage where you're super enthusiastic and you kind of blast through. And so I was chanting 72 or something every day. And Gurudev came and really noticed me and gave me like a special hand on the head blessing. And I started freaking out and I ran up to the roof and I had my first like super duper vision. And that was so groovy.
I think a lot of people would be like, so he met a mystical spiritual master. He moved to India. He became a monk. He's rigorously practicing 8 hours a day of meditation and chanting. His teacher blesses him on the forehead, and then he has a vision. What is that like?
So, yes, and there's people who might have like faith in that as being like a very real thing, and then other people who are like, you're just psyching yourself out, getting into the fervor of it. And like, exactly, that's the whole point. You do the placebo hard and you get the result, and that's the science of spirituality. And we can come back to that, but the anthropic principle kind of fits in with that too. Like, we're here, and that's why this universe is full of humans, and that's exactly why we're here, is because this is the universe where humans can be. But going back to that vision, what was it like? So I was on the roof of Rupa Sanatan Gaudiya Math, looking at the river Yamuna flowing through Vrindavan, the city of 5,000 temples that I had wanted to go to my whole life, most of my life, ever since I saw my dad's slideshow. The guy showed the slideshow after he came back from Vrindavan, and I was like, I will go there someday. And I will see Vrindavan in these red sunsets in the sand. And leading up to that too, every day I had been, every human, every gecko, every monkey, I had been offering the same prayer in English, sometimes out loud, often out loud, but at least in my head. And that prayer was, please forgive me for lifetimes of offenses to you and accept me as your humble servant. Please accept me as your servant and forgive me for my offenses. And so the culmination of that, I was on the roof and it was like I could see Radha Krishna and Chaitanya in every living thing. And everything was alive too, including the buildings and the river and the land itself. And so one example was I saw a monkey jumping, and it was like it was a fractal expression of Radharani looking for Krishna, Krishna being the self, and then the reflection looking for the self, and then that reflection was Chaitanya, and I saw it everywhere, that not only is God is looking for God, and God is God, and God is finding God. And it was like all three of those phases were just overwhelmingly satisfying, reassuring, heartbreaking, sorrowful, joyful. And I was vibrating, like hyperventilated through, probably literally had been hyperventilating through chanting so intensely. And I saw the green parrot birds flying, and they were Radharani and Krishna, and the sun was Radharani and Krishna. And it was like, at that moment, I could see God in every living being, and it was like so reassuring. It was so endearing. Every living being was dear. And then I thought, how can I reciprocate with this beautiful, endearing presence of God in all living beings? And I thought, I know, I will chant Hare Krishna and give it my beautiful chanting. And it that ended it. And it was like the beginning of a long period where I would get close to that. I was like, I got to get back there. And I was obsessed. I had to get back there. And I'd get close, and then that ego digestion would happen again. You're so good. You're doing this so well. You're so spiritual. And that ego digestion would... And later on, I started describing that as there's a veil, and on the other side of the veil, you get this unification feeling, this beautiful spiritual experience. But to fit through the veil, you can't bring your ego with you. The ego is huge, and the soul is tiny and sweet and cute, and can just go right through the threads of the veil, no harm. But if it's attached to the ego, it can't fit through. It's like a net.
I mean, it's so amazing because people, they go, and we've done, we've went to ayahuasca ceremonies, or people take psychedelics to have these crazy life-changing visions and experiences. And it's really profound that you were completely sober and you reached those states of consciousness, which is also well documented in even a really scientific standpoint, that through meditation, we can kind of jack into our brain and experience expanded states of consciousness. And what it reminds me of a little bit is the idea of the default mode network, or like the system in our brain that allows us to kind of perceive a certain snapshot of how things are. This is reality. This is me. This is boundaries. I'm not like constantly merged with all that is, right? But through meditation or psychedelics, it actually, I forget if it shuts down the default mode network or if it alters it, but essentially we lose the boundaries of self. And that's what psychedelic experiences give us, is ego dissolution. And what happens, we feel like we're all connected with every single thing in life. And sometimes that feels very impersonal, or that feels very isolated in a way. Like there's no actual consciousness there. It's sort of like we're all just part of a soup. But oftentimes it's like the sense of a being, or of a loving being, or a loving source of consciousness. And
Brahman, Paramatma, Bhagavan. Yeah.
And so your prayer to the beings of like having seen yourself almost as part of the jaws of Mother Nature devouring other beings, or part of just the cycle of samsara of killing things and being killed. And you're just like, you reach this place of humility. And then it's not so much that like you were doing something wrong by wanting to chant towards it all, but it sounds almost like it identified you as a separate other. You're like, I will do
doer.
this as rather than just being part of this amazing life painting, dance, song thing that you were experiencing.
And spoilers, I did get back there many times. Still.
Is that hard?
There are degrees, and it is like it's a learned thing. I mean, is it hard to lift a lot of weight? Maybe the first many times, but if you train, then the next time you just do it again, right? But getting back there and staying there for hours was like the next
Right.
threshold, and that was in 2012. I crossed right before you came to live with me. Actually, when we went to the first ayahuasca ceremony ever, you and I, that's when I really had that picture of the cycle of the what is it, the food chain, like the apex predators and everybody else, and like the terror and the fear and the ferociousness, and dissolving that and finding the sweetness. And that's Vrindavan, where there's this enormous harmony where the birds sing sweet songs and the trees offer fruit, and all of the living beings are focused on a center of beauty together, serving it together, like the ultimate harmony point of reality.
So that makes me think a little bit about your life's work, Dancing Ones and Zeros, and at which point, it sounds like even in college you were developing some of this thought. So you're in India, you're having visions, you're with your Gurudev. So let's just try and bring people into the present. What else did you do after that? How did you go from being a monk to not a monk? And how did you end up as a senior software developer studying science, math, physics, God?
So I came back to the United States to build a company.
This is after 10 years,
after
right?
10 years-ish, yeah. And I wanted to use what I had learned about bhakti, or devotional service to God, and incorporate that into a sort of corporate DNA and make the most successful corporation ever, like more than Facebook or Google. And yet, instead of the DNA of that being, something mundane, the DNA would be, how do we seek this sort of divine love of God in harmony with all beings on the earth, in service of each other and of the center? How do we bake that into the DNA of the corporate DNA of all corporations? Because if you can establish that this is more effective for increasing your bottom line, generating more value and getting more reciprocation from the market, if we can demonstrate that these values do that better, then all the other corporations, by their design, have to start to, it's like a virus, right? It'll take over. So that was the dream.
And you had been in India for 10 years. I hadn't seen you for at least 8 years. You were, and it's not like we talked that much.
Yeah, it was 8 years, not 10.
And it was kind of before, it was 10 years of you joining and being with your teacher.
Sure, and I came back for like a month, and then 8 years there straight.
And like the communications, this was right when Zoom this was when Skype came out. This was before Zoom. This is when Skype came out. Communication was just different, and we didn't talk. And you were also being a monk and like not completely being engaged in like communicating with your family all the time. There's letters and things, but there was like a big gap where I didn't even.
You were a little boy when I left, and it was really special coming back 8 years later and coming down to Mexico, and you were out partying, and I was just like waiting in the dark somewhere.
Dude. Okay, yeah,
wearing monk robes.
So Jaya. We're in the middle of the countryside in Mexico in an ancient 300-year-old hacienda, old dilapidated factory hotel conversion project that our father was managing, and I hadn't seen you in over 8 years, and all of a sudden you're coming back to the United States, and you're coming to visit, and I didn't really know when. And you didn't really know where we were. You just kind of knew the name of the place.
You guys gave enough instructions.
No, but it was like, on the highway towards this town, it's called this, and it's around kilometer 37 or whatever. And yeah, I was out at a party, and I came back, and you had arrived, and I talked to Dad, and he was like, yeah, I saw him. He was just wandering around in the dark, like calling out our names, essentially. Like hopefully it was the right place, because who would have known?
Actually, the taxi guy dropped me off at the paved road.
Yeah.
And then I walked on that
for like
cobblestone
a mile
road.
At least. Right. And then we got to hang out and see each other.
It was so fun hanging out with you, and then like I shared a room with you, and we programmed and we listened to what is it
Oh,
called?
Gregory and the Hawk.
Gregory and the Hawk. Blackbird
Leche,
Knot.
the album Leche
Yeah,
from
Leche,
Gregory and the
yeah.
Hawk, so good.
Love that album still.
And Coded, yeah. And so you were developing all the, and I mean, what was super exciting is like, yeah, you were not only, it wasn't that you were done being a monk, you were in monk robes, you were practicing everything, but you were like really inspired to bring your offering to the world, this amazing tech spiritual startup. You found a flower.
This is how I dance in front of the bees.
You had this vision so clearly in your mind for how software and the internet and collaboration and technology could be used in a more spiritual way to empower spiritual leaders and empower spiritual communities. And you're like, Kaylee, come on, be part of it. Let's do it. Let's make it happen. And it's really exciting. And so you came down to Mexico for a while. You're building this company. And I mean,
eventually you joined me back up in California.
I moved out of Mexico.
And that's how we ended up here in Austin. We all moved to Austin together.
And I think, to wind the story into your work, and without going into so much detail, I mean, you were a monk and now you're married.
Right. So
to an amazing person.
I actually always wanted a family and children. And growing up with the namesake Jairam, I thought I'd have one wife. But going and being a monk, there was some training to the effect of that's actually failure. If you leave the ashram and go find a woman, that's because you're not doing this higher path. But then in practice, years later, it was like, I don't think that's the way to do that, honestly. Because there's so many people who try to force themselves to do that, and then they create disturbances in society by kind of breaking the rules and trying to hide it and get away with it. And I'm not interested in that kind of a life. I want a life where everything can be outside clean and same inside. And for some people, I think there's like a natural asexual birth right that they have that can give them the capacity to really go all the way that way. And others do it in spite of all of their urges. But I think for most people, the path of least negative impact and most integrity and like solid ground for spiritual life is to be where you really are at and not try and suppress or avoid parts of yourself in the name of being like a guru.
Yeah, everyone has their own nature.
Yeah.
And it's like anyone who's been in a relationship knows it's not easy. And it's definitely its own spiritual ashram and path.
Yeah, sure.
If you really go down that way.
And it all, for me now, it all boils down to there's this relationship between myself and other takes the form of my brother and my family. And I have my wife, Jessica, is like the symbol of the whole earth of how I relate to human, if I relate to other most of the time is with her. It's the deepest connection. And without that, I kind of fell into the trap of trying to be alone. And I would notice in nature, I'd go into the forest to meditate. And the thing that made it so potent and sweet were the other living beings there. And it's hard to do that with other humans. It brings in this whole layer of psychology that you don't have to deal with if they're other species.
You're saying you would go and camp and meditate and do devotional meditation, but you'd be alone.
Great for visions and going deep inside yourself. Not great for practicing being with other humans because there aren't any there if you're alone. Being married and having a family with children is a really great way to get past your like just focus on your own self into focus on other, because the bhakti path is about love of Krishna, who is in one sense self and other, but from the perspective of the devotee, Krishna is the self and the devotee is the other.
Krishna is also the beloved in a way.
Yeah. And you're looking for the fulfillment of that need for relationship. That's what everyone is we're love junkies basically. And I'm not trying to get away from that. There's the voidist path is to be like, well, no love, no hate, nothing, just stillness, peace, cessation of suffering. But there's, love there's attachment, there's consequences, it's all kinds of stuff. But that's like the eternal infinite party. That's the flower. The flower is in the love, not in the absolute zero, dark, cold space with nothing in it. The love is in the lotus of creation that blooms and has a sweet fragrance and tries to attract a bee. That's where the love is.
So the love is in the lotus, yeah, and there's a lot of pain in love. I mean, what I think this is a great segue into self and other, therefore dancing ones and zeros. I would love to share a little bit with the world what you've been working on. You've kind of turned a lot of deep concepts into these symbols and into these diagrams. And so what is it? What is your life work?
Yeah, I have these three tenets that I like distilled from Dancing Ones and Zeros. One is God is in the middle. 2 is we're all in this together. And 3 is the self is eternal. And for me, it's actually like worth it to try and prove that to myself and others. And the consequences of establishing a rigorous math and physics framework that makes those obvious, I think are really beneficial for a thriving planet and all living beings.
What's interesting to me about doing it that way is part of the definition of empiricism and what you can experience through the senses. There's a lot of things we can't experience through the senses, like electrons. And so what we're able to do is we're able to use our senses to do tests that prove their existence, even though the senses can't directly perceive them at this time. But there's really it's so rigorous. There's really very little other ways that a thing could, like electromagnetism, right? Two magnets. There's very little ways that it's not actually like little invisible ducts getting in between the magnets that we just can't see. It's this other.
Our descriptions are pretty good, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and so by you, however, because it's sort of intangible, there is an element of physics and quantum physics and cosmology that is a little intangible, that is a little beyond the senses, a little removed from the senses. And so it does seem like a good direction to prove spirituality through that medium, because you could try and prove spirituality as many do through philosophy and words and poetry and music and song and feelings, but you're actually approaching it from a more analytical thinking point of view through math and geometry and quantum physics.
It's fascinating how you keep bringing it back to that the senses, and it's something I've kind of less aware of than right now. I'm more aware of it, but like the reality of things that aren't directly perceivable to my senses, for me, those are very loud and very real, and that doesn't mean that it is for someone I'm talking to about it at the time. It's something important to remember. That's one thing. And then what you said about empirical proof, when I was starting out, going to India, just started and trying to get better at these visions, these bhakti experiences, this rapture of love of God, I felt like I was in a labyrinth of all of the things I had learned in physics and math and science. And I couldn't just take it for granted that there was this beautiful, loving being without conquering the maze of physics facts, let's say. And I feel like I did. And that's what Dancing Ones and Zeros became for me, is like a either the specific path through the maze to get out into the bigger free spirit and light of the universe, or an algorithm to do it, or a set of tools and etc. Anyway, some method that gave me the ability. Like I used to think the way we understand plants and physiology of plants is by slicing it into slices and creating little diagrams of each little component part breaking those into parts and creating components. But that sort of precludes you from having a holistic picture of how it all works together. The more you slice it into parts, the less obvious it is as an integral whole. The plant has feelings, for example. That becomes less and less obvious the better you get at slicing it into pieces. Right. The one in the top right, that one has made me weep for hours when I first saw that. And that's got internal, external, self and other, with the aperture of experience in the middle, which is the 0 point of the self, but also defines the whole point. Self and other, right? Well, so the premise of dancing ones and zeros, let's just say, is that these are not, when we think about mathematics, we're like, yeah, everybody gets 0 and 1. Let's move on from there. We got arithmetic and geometry and trigonometry and calculus and linear algebra. And now we're starting to get interesting when we get to that realm. But fundamentally, actually with linear algebra, you come back to 0 and 1. These are not simple concepts, 0 and 1. And we sort of establish all of math and physics and science on 0 and 1 in one sense. But the relationship between 0, 1, and infinity is like profoundly intimate, personal, and spiritual thing.
Can we break that down? Why? Why is that? Because, I mean, when I first hear it, what it comes to me is nothing and something.
Nothing, everything, and something in between.
And so why do you say it's spiritually intimate?
Well, nothing, everything, and something in between are, again, just a list of words. 0, 1, infinity, again, a list of words. And so for me, I've taken 0 and 1 and infinity and all of these different terms, and I've meditated on them, and they are a state of being. They're an internal vision that lines up with those words when I speak about it. So it's a little like I could just say, well, just 0 and 1, and like, isn't that amazing, right? But here we are speaking words to have a conversation to convey meaning. So,
and part of that is the math and the physics side of it actually does help rigorous. To get someone else to that place in their own mind and body.
And it's a shared language that has a certain extreme rigor to it when you start using math and physics. And a lot of this stuff yields experiments where we can verify theories, and that's interesting. I don't know that we'll get time for that here, but we're all in this together. There's some experiments that we could anyway. So this diagram, if you look with your eyes at the room, and we have this experience of being at the core of that which we're aware of. And we can kind of start to think of things in terms of outside and inside, right? It's not so simple, like oxygen and nitrogen in the air is now inside my lungs. Vaguely that makes sense, but we also know that over time it's going in and out. And in space, there's some transition that's like right here. I mean, it's which one is in and out. It's getting you can have sealed chambers, but they're not perfectly sealed. There's diffusion going on all over the place. This is the first meditation on 0 and 1. Is it's extremely difficult to define one of something. And I used to have an essay where it's like the less than 1 second fuzzy ring. You're trying to define a circle, let's say. And a circle, by definition, is on a two-dimensional plane, all points equidistant from a center point. So you have your 0 point. We're not even getting into how complicated that is yet. But you have your 0 point, and then you have points, all points that are equidistant from that 0 point. In theory, our mind can be like, yeah, circle, I get it now. But if you try and actualize that for the senses, you could take a piece of paper and draw a very precise circle. But if you zoom in, you'll discover that there's a lot of variety even in the way that the graphite hits the paper. If you zoom really closely in, it's all over the place. That's in a snapshot in time. It's already, and it's like you might miss. So if you make it thick enough, you can make a ring. And you can segment it and say there's at least some graphite in each of these segments, like a pie, pie. But you also know that there was a time before that ring existed, and there's a time where it'll get crumpled up and thrown away or deteriorate. So hence the less than 1 second fuzzy ring. So we started off with this nice platonic circle concept, but in practice, when a substance is involved, when you have to actually describe anything in a manifest way, it starts to get really complicated. And it gets particularly complicated when we bring large timescales into it, because you come in and out of existence in this form relatively quickly on a sort of geological or universal timescale. 0 point and whole point. So again, setting 0 point aside and just thinking about the whole point is some kind of interplay between the sort of ground that things are standing on and all that is, right? Because when you're trying to describe, or the circle example again, let's say it's pixels on a screen. Well, that's taking a lot of things into consideration. It's generating light, photons that hit your eyes. Without your eyes and the photons, is the circle there? So it's like it's incorporating basically everything there is, directly or indirectly, over enough time. It's all entangled with that definition of that one thing. So to describe one of something essentially takes everything. It's on the foundation of I call 0 point the source of all substance, because 0 apples and 0 oranges are the same thing. So that's where all substances intersect, is at the 0 point. So it's the foundation of all of these different substances. But once you have 1 apple or 1 orange, they're apples and oranges now. But at 0 apples and 0 oranges, they're unified. Mm-hmm. So there's this common center that everybody, everything, everyone, every particle has. And that's that 0 point. And the 0 point is my self point, right? It's the point that everything of my experience is organized around. And there's some continuum between the most non-changing 0 point that I'm aware of and everything else outside that I'm aware of. There's some continuum. You could draw a line from that 0 to, like, from the center of the circle to the edge of the circle and then out. And that edge of the circle is like an aperture. You have these apertures and these apertures and these apertures. You have skin touch apertures. You have mental meaning
sensory
token
input aperture.
So taken all together, the input of other, something non-you, coming in through those apertures, it touches that aperture and it reflects internally, and it gets embedded into who you are over time, memories and scars and impressions. It gets embedded deeper and deeper and deeper, until what happened to you trillions of lifetimes ago is now instinctual. Or not trillions of lifetimes ago, but let's say we, for a minute, believe in reincarnation. You went through all these animal species, and so those instincts awarded you with a brain that has all of the different reptilian brains embedded in it.
Or even if it's an evolutionary standpoint, you're the
You've
latest fruit of your
instincts.
ancestors, right?
Totally works just as well. So you've inherited that instinctual memory of the outside other passing through the aperture and getting interpreted and embedded. And now here we are on the precipice of the present, projecting into the future our will, where we want to go next, left or right, based on everything we've gone through. And that's the fundamental mechanism of our experience through time. And
will and desire, and what do we have a
choice. We have a choice to make based on who we are and what we seek. Our favorite flavor. We're a favorite flavor picker. And there's so much more to be said about that, but the ecstasy lies in being able to perceive your reality as a infinite continuity through all possible flavors, and an inevitability that because you have a desire for a flavor that is coming from the deepest core where you started, your favorite flavor, that is in fact what reality is that flavor. And for you, that's an inevitability that'll be present for you.
So is there some, because we're talking about the 0 point and the whole point, is there some component of, this is hyper simplified and not exactly it, but if I can imagine it, if I can desire it, sort of Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Maharaj's
Exactly
own
that.
thing, because I seek it, because I desire it and can imagine it, it exists in some way.
The end is present in the beginning, symbolic harmony. You have a core desire that is present now as part of yourself. It is the most core part of yourself, and that is reality. And everything else is a sort of transient interplay between all possible configurations of matter and the aperture of your experience. But the like self-emanating source of your decision-making cycle is coming from this reality of like this kernel of desire, of love, of taste. Rasuvai Saha, he is the flavor. You are the taste, is the taste. So the whole point, being halfway between everything outside and everything inside, the whole point is where the self interacts with other. And we seek together for our favorite flavors. And that's why there's some dissonance between what I'm tasting right now and what I wish I was tasting, because there's this impact that we have on each other. I go this way and it drags everyone with me a little bit. So we're all actually going together. But at the end of the day, the favorite flavor is not out there in other. This becomes udipan. This becomes a way to remind your attention of your favorite flavor. And so we seek an environment that reinforces our ability to relish our own favorite flavor, which comes from inside. And just because it comes from inside doesn't mean it's disconnected from everything else. In fact, that's the only point that is connected to everything else, is the 0 point, just like the apple, zero orange. That's where all of the whole beings are connected, is at that 0 point.
I was listening to Sam Harris and Andrew Huberman on the Huberman Labs podcast, and honestly, like from the Hare Krishna Hindu Vaishnava perspective, I used to just feel triggered by Sam Harris because he's very rational, very empirical. He's gone down like the Buddhist path, but he's like, I think he would consider himself an atheist, and so it was hard to receive any of what he said. But his conversation with Andrew Huberman was amazing, and he goes in depth about meditation. And what you were just saying reminds me of their conversation a little bit, because the goal that we have, especially in spiritual paths, the goal we have to get to where we're going also creates a gap. And that gap keeps us from arriving. And there's this tension between getting there and actual work and self-development and growth that has to happen, but also this arrival, because when we get there, if we're not arriving there, we won't have arrived and we'll still just be going. And so what you just said sounds a little bit like that. That's like good. There's this present moment in, we're looking outside. You called it Udipan. There's a reminder. And it sounds like from your time in India, like you were able to arrive many times in your life.
That's the crux of it. The ecstasy is in arriving at the place you wish to be and staying there for a long time,
which is almost like a tightrope.
It is, because if you stay there and you don't go off and on, then you lose the actual flavors arriving. Right? So you can't arrive somewhere if you're already there.
Which is a whole interesting thing. We were talking about union and separation, and it's like okay, if you arrive and you don't ever leave, that's sort of nirvana. That's sort of voidism, nirvana, right? Yeah. Whereas if you enjoy drama,
Leela is, so bhakti, which is devotion in one interpretation, is actually a literal definition of bhakti is sequence. And so there's desire seed requires there being a differentiation between current state and desired state. In fact, desire comes first, and the consequence is a gap. And bhakti is when the devotee does actions that close the gap from separation to meeting. And separation is the separation of self into self and other. So other and self trying to meet again, to be whole together, clear the obstacles to their meeting through bhakti, a sequence of moving closer together, a sequence of actions. And then when they meet and they arrive, that is that ecstasy. But if it stays like that, then there's nirvana. It's just the light. It's just the infinite light. There's no flavor. Or there is a flavor, but you lose the ability to taste it because it's permanent.
There's some so just so everyone can know, if they don't, like, you're not just making up a whole bunch of stuff, you're pulling from different sources. Could you kind of just go through a little bit briefly some of the great thinkers and sources that you are kind of combining, from both the maybe like physics world as well as the Vedic world, because you're even in that, you're maybe, especially with the math and science part, like some of these things you find have been discussed already in a rigorous format.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, the Rasa Tattva section of Jaya Dharma by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur comes to mind. Rupa Goswami was writing this rasic literature to sort of encapsulate what are the ingredients of transcendental experience, because just like these bodies are made of physical ingredients, the internal experience is made of flavors of love. And so really getting precise about those flavors and which ones mix well, which ones go up, which ones are destructive and constructive interference, which ones are a boss, like if they come together, it destroys the flavor. Permanent flavors, transitory flavors, it's just like a whole field of study of flavor picking.
And Srila Rupa Goswami is a medieval celebrated Sanskrit poet and Vaishnav master who's celebrated in all of India.
Celebrated as being extremely near to the center, Radharani and Krishna.
And from the math and science side? Because I know that from
there's
cosmology,
contemporary stuff that like I love Wolfram stuff and Penrose, cyclic conformal cosmology from Penrose, and Wolfram's like automata, and the concept of the like all possible laws of physics creates a graph, and then each of those starting points is a graph of the physical universe that comes out of that. And even if you just let that loose without any constraints, you still end up with places where there's coherence and places where there's incoherence, and the places where there's coherence is kind of touching on the anthropic concept, right? You can't have these kinds of interactions in the incoherent realm. And so there's this kind of winking to the inevitability of flavor tasters, we being the flavor tasters, and our residence in a realm where that is feasible. This is a magical time we're in when our physics is mystical like this.
It's true. It is true. And if I had to sum up what I get from some of your work, it's like you've found ways to back up your argument for being optimistic about what's going on in the universe and not just being sentimental.
That's a really groovy way to say my life's work. Dancing Ones and Zeros fundamentally is a confirmation that at the core of existence there is a kind of loving beauty, interaction between self and other, that makes all of the difficulty worth it. It was worth it. This reality, this existence is worth it. Even in the ugly and the horrible, if those are the price, those are the consequence. Without existence, there'd be no love. And if the consequence is whatever difficulties there are, which is like easy for someone to say who hasn't suffered in this life as much as someone else maybe has. But the great saintly people, some of them had suffered terribly, and their conclusion was identical, that I would die a million painful deaths to wipe off one bead of sweat.
Yeah, I
from
mean,
God's feet.
Viktor Frankl comes to mind with Man's Search for Meaning, and just like, you know, the horrors of concentration camps and what people would, how people could find something of beauty in the most hellish situations. And so many of those beautiful moments came down to like humor, comedy, plays, theater, art, creativity. Like there's certain things that shine a light in the darkest moments that are extraordinary. And it's the biggest argument or critique against religion is, well, if God's real, and then you get into like sub arguments, like if it's a loving God, what if it's not a loving God, right? But if a loving God is real, then why do we see kids with a burrowing parasite in its eyes, right? There's this moral thing, but then you could kind of come back to that whole empirical thing, which is technically morals are not real based on the definition of like an empirical evidence. They're not a thing that you can observe, and that's like a whole conversation, but they're not a thing that you can measure and observe with your senses that are real. They're these agreements that we come to as a society about how things are going to be, and that changes over time, right? And so we do have a critique towards the universe, that it's so hellish and it's so crazy and intense and it devours us. And we kind of, a lot of us, myself mainly speaking for myself, it's like it's easy to be angry at existence and like, why is it like this, right?
The food chain. I say it often. I'm challenged by the food chain, like polar bears eating seal pups in front of the seal mom.
Yeah.
Like just chomping it. That's hard. And so it comes back to the self being eternal, and we're all in this together. And it's like, you know, Jesus would weep for the starving and suffering people. And the idea is not that there won't be, I don't believe there will ever be a time where there's no universe full of all of the complexities we see right now. But for an individual, there is a trajectory through experience where it is inevitable that it will continue to seek its own sense of beauty and experience love. And that is the promise of our own internal world. If we look inside, we see that we have the ability to experience beauty and love, and it's in and of itself is the proof that it's real. That is the experience. That is the pudding, right? And so it's on us to continually seek that and grow that and evolve that, but it's also inevitable. That's who we are. We're seeking that, and given infinite time to achieve that, it is inevitable that we'll achieve that beautiful state over and over and over again, increasing forever. And right now, it may be a lot of up and down and pain and suffering for any one given individual. But if that is the mechanism of reality, is that each individual has infinite chances to explore all possible versions of reality and relationship and ultimately find its favorite one and grow that forever, bingo, right? And the consequence and the price is what it is. I'm kind of saying the ends justify the means. And yeah, if everybody has infinite redos, then I think that's a fair philosophy.
It changes the whole experience of the game if we're never destroyed truly, right? And there's a lot to go into there, and that will have to be another episode. Time, yeah. But I will say that being your brother is really special, and I'm really grateful because it is a wild ride. Life is a wild ride, and having you also being 8 years older than me, having your perspective and your experience and your experiments out there in this trippy place is so reassuring and so helpful and interesting and fun. Ultimately, it's super fun to get to play here with you and get to create. And I just love what you're bringing to the world, and I really hope that the listeners check you out. Any final thoughts?
I'm really grateful for you in my life too. You're the person that I've kind of like been the most excited to watch grow for the longest. Like that's been really rewarding. You are a stellar human being, and I'm looking forward to decades. I like that you said it's fun.
So fun.
It's
man.
like that's the point at the end. Is so you're playing with your friends.
That's my whole
God
thing.
wants to play with his friends. That's the
My
deal
name
here.
literally means play. Your
Christian
name means
McKaylee,
victory.
right? Yay.
Which is like,
Woo!
we played well.
Thanks for playing with me. And this is a fun way. This is a fun way to try and capture it. I mean,
we should do more. We got to
yeah.
do more because you have so.
JayaMarks.com. Like and subscribe. No, I'll definitely.
Is that a thing?
I have JayaMarks.com. It's
Okay,
just
go
a
visit JayaMarks.com.
portfolio of rando videos.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, go to JayaMarks.com to find out more about
my YouTube channel is probably what I'll end up
giving me
cultivating the most.
Okay.
Thanks
for coming on to Amplify
Hare
What You Love,
Krishna.
man. Hare Krishna.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Haribo.
Namaste.
Radhe
No,
Radhe.
now I'm gonna go though.
Now I'm gonna go.
Yeah.
Now I'm gonna go.